Of Edmonton, Alberta's premier is talking about calling in the armed forces, if necessary, to protect the province's energy reserves in the wake of today's terrorist attacks in the United States. This according to Canadian press. Ralph Klein says Alberta supplies a large amount of the oil and natural gas consumed in the U.S. and therefore must take precautions. I've just been told that George Bush has now landed his aircraft has landed, the Air Force One, at the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska. And we're expecting more details on that. So the president is flying into the American Midwest. We started off in Florida this morning, then to Louisiana. Now he's gone right into the heart of the country in Nebraska to the SAC headquarters, Strategic Air Command headquarters at an Air Force base in Nebraska. Whether that's a temporary stop or whether that's where he's going to be staying for a while, we do not know, and we will continue to monitor that situation. There's a huge security cordon now around Washington, D.C., which was the site of a couple of the attacks today, both a car bomb outside the U.S. State Department and a commercial airliner slamming into the side, a 757, into the side of the Pentagon, where there is said to be a serious devastation and major casualties at the Pentagon as well. Many key routes into the District of Columbia, that's Washington, are now restricted. Bridges closed down. Incredible. We're also just receiving word from our bureau in Whitehorse that a plane is just a few minutes away from landing in Whitehorse. U.S. and Canadian fighters intercepted the plane over Alaska. They are treating it as a hijacked aircraft. When it's on the ground, police are going to board the plane and lock it down. This is information I'm just reading coming in from our Whitehorse Bureau. Obviously, we're going to be monitoring that. There were a number of reports like that this morning of aircraft that were said to have been hijacked, which were being forced to land. Some of those turned out not to be true. Others, unfortunately, turned out to be very, very true. We'll keep an eye on the Whitehorse story, monitor it for you. All right, as we continue to look at these pictures from New York City and the smoke still billowing over that city, this is the scene in, I believe this is in Washington, people streaming out of their offices in the immediate area surrounding the Pentagon, leaving, this was earlier, this is tape, after the aircraft slammed into the U.S. Defense Department headquarters at the Pentagon building. We're told there are serious casualties there and massive devastation. One of the Red Cross Medica-Evac helicopters, along with the FBI, in that immediate area. U.S. fighter jets in the skies above that nation's capital. Now back to pictures from Washington, and these are earlier pictures. If you haven't seen them before, you will see these twin towers about to collapse. This is the live picture from New York City. All right, enough of that. Let's get to back to monitoring the situation here. Terry Malewski joins us now from the airport in Vancouver. Terry, we've already bounced back and forth across the country from airport to airport and seeing the situation. Many overseas aircraft being forced to land in Canadian airspace because they can't get into the United States. What's the situation there?
Well, Peter, obviously we have a bit of a bottleneck here on the West Coast now because Vancouver is the only major Canadian airport on the West Coast, and there is a massive amount of traffic, as you know, Trans-Pacific, destined for everywhere from San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle. And all of these flights, almost all of them, have been diverted now to Vancouver. And there is a serious problem here in handling the load because not just that these planes weren't destined for Canada, they don't have Canadian landing cards to hand out on board, but because there are extraordinary security measures being demanded by the FBI and the Canadian Transport Ministry affecting every single passenger. We're hearing reports now that some of these planes are circling for as much as an hour before they can land here. There are, at last report, between now, it's now just noon Pacific time, between now and 5 p.m. Pacific time, we're expecting as many as 23 large aircraft. I'm not speaking of the small ones now, but wide bodies, 747s, 767s, large aircraft with hundreds of passengers, 23 of them expected here between now and 5 p.m. That probably means between 4, 5, and up to 6,000 passengers. Each one of those passengers is is going to be searched by the RCMP very thoroughly. It's going to take up to 2 hours. So you may circle for an hour, then sit on the tarmac for maybe another hour waiting for the plane ahead of you, then another couple of hours before you can get out to a place where you don't even want to be. Buses are being brought in to take these passengers to an undisclosed location, but it's moving so slowly, Peter, that we've got only a few hundred, even now, 4.5 hours after these attacks in New York, only a few hundred passengers on these diverted aircraft have come through Vancouver, and thousands are expected. It's a major bottleneck, and authorities here are quite nervous about how they're going to handle it all.
All right, Terry, thanks very much. We go from Vancouver Airport to the Toronto Airport, where officials are giving the latest update on the situation there. Let's hear it here now.
The airspace in Canada, that exists until 6 p.m. this afternoon, evening, and until further notice. I understand they've had a press release. That I also understand is by an issue of the Minister of Transport. We have effectively closed Pearson Airport to normal operations at this point. So scheduled flights in and out of the airport effectively have not been happening today and will not likely happen for the rest of the day. Our priority has been to receive diverted flights that were bound to destinations within the U.S. Update I can give you on that is that approximately 20 to 25 flights are being diverted to Pearson at this point. Some are starting to come in right now. We don't expect any more than that. My understanding is that earlier today there were in excess of 500 flights being diverted this morning. Of those 500, I think there are 100 or even less than that right now that still need to be diverted somewhere. We are accepting 20 to 25 of those. That's about it for any update I can give you, and I'll now take your questions.
How many planes have been diverted? How many planes have landed here already?
Approximately, I'd give an approximate 4 or 5 at this point.
Okay.
One did take off. Can you tell us about the plane that took off about an hour ago?
I'm not aware of a plane that took off. I don't have any details on that.
2 Lufthansa planes land. Were they destined for the U.S. and those were diverted here?
I don't have any specific information on the flights themselves. We have told NAV Canada and the FAA that we will receive aircraft here, regardless of where they're destined to or where they're from. We will take them. We will deal with that here. I'm not going to get into specific issues of the flight numbers or people on that flight because I don't want to give out inaccurate information.
Are passengers staying on the planes when they land? What's happening to the passengers?
Passengers will be, as much as it can be normal operations, passengers will be gated, taken off their planes, put through necessary procedures. If they're international passengers, they will be put through immigrations and customs. And at that point, airlines will be making plans for accommodations for these people. I'm sure helping them find a place.
Is there enough room in town to make those accommodations? I mean, surely, are there enough hotels to take on the extra?
I'm not sure. Again, that's an airline issue. I'm sure they're doing their best to try to find accommodations for these people.
Could you just clarify
Peter, what about the
how
emergency
many
task
planes
force?
have been diverted or will be diverted in all to Pearson?
20 to 25.
Out of 500?
Our understanding is there are in excess of 500 diverted planes this morning from American airspace, and of that total, only 20 to 25 at this point have been diverted to Pearson.
Is that all you can handle?
No, it's not. It's not a matter of us handling it. We're not making the decision of how many we get. That's done by the air traffic controllers, and it's a coordinated effort. It depends on how much fuel a plane had, where it was at the time, and what the closest airport for diversion is. So it's not it's just that's what we've been told we're getting.
When
Do you have
go ahead, Pam.
An estimate of the number of passengers that are stranded here? Presumably there are thousands of passengers in the airport right now and possibly thousands more to come. How many?
I wouldn't say that we're not in an issue where we have an unusual amount of thousands of passengers stranded in the airport. You got to remember that on a given day, we handle about 84 aircraft movements in a given hour. That is the number we have. So that's arrivals and departures. We're talking about 20 to 25 aircraft for the remainder of the day here today. So as far as volume goes, this is not considered huge volume from the airport's perspective. We normally have in excess of 75,000 people coming through this airport in a given day.
What is the airport telling the passengers when they land?
The latest update from the Toronto International Airport, and as Peter Gregg quite correctly points out, this is now no longer a problem for the airports because the only aircraft they're having to deal with are the ones that are stuck now in their cities, that there are new aircraft aren't coming in. The problem is obviously for the passengers. As Terry Malewski pointed out, once they're on the ground, they're involved in long delays and security measures. Not surprising. I'm sure when they're made fully aware of what's at stake here right now, passengers' tempers, which can move fairly quickly around airports, given delays. Given this situation, I think they'll understand in an awful hurry why they are being delayed, and quite hopefully will not be bothered by that. This is a live shot from Halifax International Airport, and look at that lineup of the big aircraft that have been forced to land in Halifax because they could not head on to their destinations elsewhere in North America, primarily in the United States. Linda Kelly has been monitoring the Halifax situation for us all day, and here's her report on that.
By the end of the day, you'll receive 20 to 25 flights. What time?
It's hard to say right now. I would suspect in the next few hours these planes will be finished arriving at Pearson.
President Bush should act. Are those all going to Canadian airports?
No, I understand they're not. Some planes that were international, or they're international departures.
It's frightening that people will use terrorism on other people for political ends. It's very, very frightening to us.
One Canadian airport worker tried to reach his daughter in Washington.
She's supposed to actually go for an interview for the Canadian Embassy, I don't know, sometime this week. I don't know if it was today or not, so I'm kind of worried about it.
At least 50 flights will be rerouted to the Halifax airport this afternoon. All outgoing flights at the airport have been cancelled.
Air Canada and the other Canadian carriers have suspended operations in Canada. Transport Canada have asked us to remove all non-essential people from airside, which in effect shuts down the airport.
Many of the flights have already touched down, with planes from airlines from around the world. Security is tight.
We're monitoring the situation as it proceeds, and at this time, as I said, we will not be offloading the aircraft.
The planes are parked on a runway that has been shut down. Passengers are being kept on board. The RCMP are doing a security sweep of each plane. When the passengers leave the plane, the Red Cross will be there to help them. An emergency number will be provided for those trying to locate their relatives. Emergency measures officials in the Halifax Regional Municipality are scrambling to find a place for the hundreds of passengers that will be pouring into the city. There are few rooms available. Officials plan to open emergency centers in sports complexes and schools. They may even ask the public to help take people in. Halifax hotels are doing their best to prepare.
We have contacted a counsellor to come down and assist us in dealing with some of our U.S. customers who may be obviously upset by the news today.
There are 4 cruise ships docked in Halifax. These passengers are from New York City.
How could you do that to working people? You're not on a battlefield.
Hard to describe, explain rather. I'm getting a little emotional, I'm sorry.
Okay.
The Lord be with you.
At St. Mary's Basilica in downtown Halifax, a much larger congregation than usual has gathered for a noon mass. Meanwhile, security has been tightened at all military installations, including this one at the Halifax dockyard. Linda Kelly, CBC News, Halifax.
Well, from Linda Kelly's report from Halifax, back to the live shot from New York City, where the smoke and debris still continue to pour into the sky. Mainly now, obviously the smoke from adjoining buildings next to the World Trade Center that have been severely damaged as a result of the collapse of those buildings following the apparent terrorist attacks by 2 commercially hijacked aircraft that slammed into them early this morning. But to give you a sense, that was 6 hours ago, and still the sky is littered with the after effects of those attacks. More continuing effects from what's happened across the United States today, primarily in Washington and New York. The U.S. now has closed its part of the St. Lawrence Seaway. jointly operated between Canada and the United States. It's closed its portion of the St. Lawrence Seaway. NATO foreign ministers in Brussels, Belgium, have just gone into an emergency meeting there. It started about 15 minutes ago to deal with the wave of attacks on U.S. cities. NATO has declared a maximum state of alert. That means all its forces deployed across Western Europe are at the high state of readiness. There will be a news conference by NATO's Secretary General, George Robertson, in about an hour's time, and obviously we will do our best to get you live coverage of that if it is available. Let's go back to Washington, where, as we watch these pictures from both New York and Washington, let's go back to Washington, where the CBC's David Hulton has been standing by all day. He was over near the Pentagon earlier and the State Department earlier today. He joins us now from our bureau in Washington. David, your sense now, what can you tell us?
Well, a couple of new developments in the last hour and a half here, Peter. The mayor of Washington has ordered a state of emergency. Hardly a surprise after the city has virtually been evacuated. All federal buildings evacuated, the West Wing of the White House, the Capitol building, the Justice Department, and so on. We're still waiting word from the Pentagon about the extent of casualties when the bombing occurred at 9:43 a.m. when that plane slammed into the West Wing of the Pentagon. The Glenn Flood, one of the Pentagon spokespersons, has said that there were extensive casualties, quote, and an unknown number of fatalities. Can't be any surprise to anyone who watched that. I was probably about 2 kilometers away, and this huge black cloud erupted over the Pentagon building. You can see it there. And within about 20 minutes, and you couldn't get out of the airport, all roads were closed at that point, you could see ash and debris beginning to fall quite close to where I was standing, which was a good kilometer and a half away from the Pentagon. So this was a huge explosion at a time when the Pentagon was all personnel were in and working, obviously, at 9:43. They get in very early in the morning in the Pentagon. So there's a tremendous concern here that the casualty toll will be very high from the Pentagon bombing.
Now, the President of the United States was in Florida earlier this morning. He's since been to Louisiana, where he was whisked off to, and now we're told he is in Nebraska at the Strategic Air Command headquarters in Nebraska. Any details at all being released by White House officials as to the movements of the president? Obviously, he's not heading back to Washington, at least not yet.
Which is just another indication of the apprehension and concern felt in the administration about the situation and possible dangers in Washington. Highly unusual, though, for a president to fly to the Strategic Air Command in Nebraska. It's where, of course, it's one of the centers of the U.S. military communications. It's where an air attack or missile attack could well be launched if by order of the president, or if information came in from NORAD headquarters in Colorado. Highly unusual. We're also told, incidentally, that the senior congressional leaders from both the Senate and the House have been moved out of Washington to an undisclosed location. So presumably there'll be some contact between President Bush and the congressional leaders who are at an undisclosed location. We don't know where.
All right, David, let me just stop you for a second. I want to update everybody on the situation in Whitehorse in Yukon, where there have been a number of incidents in the past few minutes. We are now told the updated situation is 2 planes have landed at Whitehorse. They are both Korean airliners. One is a cargo aircraft. The other is a 747 passenger jet. Now, the second one, I'm assuming that is the passenger jet, is being treated as a hijacked plane. That doesn't mean it is a hijacked plane. It means it's being treated as a hijacked plane. We're told that 2 CF-18 fighter jets, those are the Canadian Armed Forces fighters, escorted the aircraft into Whitehorse. Details obviously very sketchy on this one at the moment, and how this relates to the overall story of the day, we are not sure. We'll continue to get more details on that as they develop. But 2 aircraft have been forced down in Whitehorse. One was a cargo aircraft, the other is a passenger flight, and the passenger flight is being treated, we are told, as a hijacked plane. That doesn't mean it is one, but it is being treated as one, and one assumes at this very time they are trying to determine whether or not it was. 2 Canadian Forces CF-18 fighter jets escorted that aircraft onto the ground. We'll continue to monitor that. David, the whole sense, this image of the U.S. president being whisked away to a base in the Midwestern United States, senior officials of the cabinet and the Congress being whisked away to secret locations. It sounds like a movie. It sounds like a novel. It's the kind of thing we've heard about, could happen, but have never actually witnessed happening, which, as you say, underlines the situation at this hour. Clearly, if they know what's going on, they're very fearful of what could still happen, or they clearly still don't know what's going on. It's got to be one of those two.
Well, that's a good point, and clearly the long delay in any officials coming forward with more details about the bombing attacks is a reflection of the immense confusion that seemed to reign in the administration in Washington and in the White House staff, first in Florida, then in Louisiana, and now in Nebraska, about what actually was happening and how they should best respond. We're now told, Peter, that Bush plans to convene an urgent meeting of his top national security aides via a teleconference from the air base in Nebraska. Apart from that, no other details have come through. That official who was quoted earlier as saying there were some indications of a link with Osama bin Laden is now saying that has yet to be determined, that there's still no proof of that. But he did mention indications. We don't know what those indications were, although, and you may have noticed this in the flood of information that you've been submerged with over the past few hours, you may have noticed that there could be a link between the fact that one Osama bin Laden associate was due to be sentenced in Wednesday on New York by a federal judge at a courthouse just a couple of blocks, I believe, from the World Trade Center. This was an associate who was convicted of involvement in one of the 2 African embassy attacks, this one in Tanzania, where I believe more than 200 people were killed. So that sentencing was scheduled to take effect in New York, very close to the World Trade Center, on Wednesday. But as I say, that could have a lot to do with these events or nothing to do with it at all. So again, we should be a little careful about tying possibly unrelated events together.
All right, good point. Once again, it is difficult on days like this. You're dealing with a lot of information that's coming in a rapid way, a lot of claims, counterclaims, suspicions and rumors. One thing you are not dealing with here, though, is any ignorance of the facts of what we've witnessed today. The twin towers of the World Trade Center in New York have been demolished, destroyed, and those are pictures of the firefighters and rescue workers trying to deal with the situation there and pick through the rubble that was left by this. One of the towers falling down between 10 and 10:30 this morning, New York time. One fell down at 10, the other fell down at 10:30. It is amazing now as more details start to come in of the number of people who were on board these hijacked aircraft who tried to get calls through to people on the ground in the final minutes before crashing. One of the American networks, ABC, now reporting that government sources say a flight attendant on American Airlines Flight 11, that was the first hijacked aircraft to hit the World Trade Center, managed to call the American Airlines Flight Operations Center. That was a flight that was leaving from Boston heading to Los Angeles, informed them that 2 flight attendants had been stabbed and hijackers had stormed the flight deck. There has been some suspicion throughout this day that no matter how pilots were being threatened, none of them could have brought themselves to crash their aircraft into the World Trade Center, and the suspicion has been that if in fact they wouldn't, that the hijackers wouldn't even wait for them. They would eliminate the pilots and take over the seats and aim the aircraft straight at the World Trade Center. We may never know what happened in those final moments in the cockpits of these various aircraft. Obviously, there will be attempts to recover black boxes, flight recorders, to try and get as much detail as possible, but some of the details, horrifying as they are, starting to trickle out. Now, we've reached on the phone Lorna Tessier of the Canadian Blood Services, who joins us from Ottawa. We have had reports throughout the day of the desperate need in New York City and in Washington for blood, and the calls going out in different parts of the country, including from Premier Mike Harris, that for Canadians who want to donate blood, they should get in touch with their local Canadian Blood Services office. Well, let's try and find out exactly what the situation is. Lorna Tessier, why don't you tell us what is the situation as far as you know it?
Well, what we're asking Canadian Blood Services is that Canadians call the 1-888-2-DONATE phone line to make an appointment to donate blood. This will be to meet the increased need that we're anticipating. At this point in time, we haven't been asked to respond by shipping blood, but we are anticipating that is a possibility, and we would try to do everything to help at that time. The response has been overwhelming, so the phone lines are very busy, and we're asking for everyone's patience. That many Canadians have already come forward, and we'd like to thank them for their support.
And I would imagine that no matter where they are, they can find the ability to donate blood, that whichever part of the country is not a problem for you in terms of eventually shipping blood?
Not at all. That 1-888-2-DONATE number will give the individual all the local information that they need, the clinic hours, the location of the clinic, additional clinics that we will be adding, and that will allow them to make an appointment to go in and actually donate. Now,
you say you haven't had, as far as you're aware, you haven't had any direct requests for help yet from south of the border?
Not as yet, no.
When and if that comes, how would it likely come? Is that a government-to-government thing? How would that work?
In some occasions, it could come government-to-government. It could also come hospital-to-hospital. It could also come through the American Red Cross as well. So we're anticipating that it could basically come in a number of ways.
Okay, well, let's go over your message then. Canadians anywhere in the country who are able to donate should be able to if they call this number. That's the 1-888-236-6283, and the operators there will direct them to the appropriate location to give blood donations?
That's correct. It's also important that donors come forward not only over the next few days, but over the next few weeks. We really want to make sure that we can maintain a stable and ongoing supply.
All right. Lorna Tessier, thank you very much for this, and we will keep putting that number up on the screen because, as we've already seen, and you're already giving us evidence that Canadians are responding in huge numbers already. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Once again, that number, we'll have it up on the screen throughout this day. We should tell you that we are planning to stay on the air at least until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning as the situation continues to unfold throughout this continent and around the world. As we've told you that, I'm just being told that please follow that number directly. It's 1-888. It's not 1-800. It's a 1-888-236-6283. We're monitoring situations not only here in this country, certainly south of the border in the United States, as the continuing reaction to today's developments occurs, and we try to determine on the part of the U.S. government just what its reaction and action is going to be as a result of this, but also around the world. There is an emergency meeting going on right now of NATO ambassadors in Brussels, Belgium, and from there will be a news conference, we're told, in about another half hour's time, and we'll hear the reaction of NATO, which has declared a maximum state of alert at all its operations. Still, we are being told in New York, the picture you're seeing, the major smoke that's still billowing into the sky coming from the area immediately around where the World Trade Center was, but also from the buildings in the immediate area that have been damaged, that are on fire. We're being told that emergency officials say it's still too dangerous to go into the rubble of the towers. They say they feel helpless, and they must, and beneath the rubble and perhaps even on top of some parts of it, there are still, it's expected that there are thousands of people who are there, and their state, obviously, we can only imagine how horrible that must be. Keep in mind that what we're dealing with here is a building that could have housed as many as 50,000 people, 110 to 120 stories high. It's collapsed, leveled. You can only imagine the rubble that is on the ground in that immediate area. We're trying to put all of this in context for you. We're trying to give you the latest developments as they occur. At a time like this, some of the details that come through pass our hands. Some turn out not to be true. Others, unfortunately, are devastatingly true. We're keeping our eye on the situation in Whitehorse, where 2 aircraft have been forced onto the ground. We're told they're both Korean aircraft, one a cargo jet, one a 747 passenger aircraft. The passenger aircraft has been treated as a hijacked plane. We're told that a couple of Canadian fighter jets, CF-18s, escorted that plane onto the ground. And with any luck, we should have somebody on the phone with us in the next few moments from Whitehorse to give us the latest situation. Scott Regier. Scott Regier is our reporter on this situation in Whitehorse. Scott, can you hear me? Hello, Scott Regier in Whitehorse. It's Peter Mansbridge. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Peter.
Okay, Scott, what can you tell us that's confirmed as to what's happened there?
Well, I can tell you it's been a nerve-wracking morning here. We're all about 400 meters right now from where 2 Korean airliners have arrived in the last hour or so. The first was a cargo aircraft, the second a passenger aircraft. As I speak, there's 3 F-18 fighters circling around the city of Whitehorse, observing the situation. Nobody has come out of the passenger aircraft. The Korean airliner was intended to land in Alaska, but it has been diverted to Whitehorse, as has the cargo plane as well.
Do we have any reason to believe it's anything other than an aircraft that was diverted?
At this point, no. We have spoken with the authorities locally here, with the RCMP. They are treating the one aircraft, I understand is the passenger aircraft with Korean, as a hijacking situation, simply because they haven't received communication from the pilot on board, and they're taking things very, very cautiously, as you might imagine.
All right. Well, we're going to let you continue to monitor that situation. As you say, nobody's come out of that plane since it landed?
We have kept an eye on it for the last hour since it's arrived, and nobody has come out yet.
All right. Well, as soon as you know anything more, please let us know. Scott Regier reporting to us from Whitehorse as we continue to show you these pictures from New York City this morning and the devastating impact of that aircraft smashing into the side of the World Trade Center, one of the towers. Within an hour and a half of that, both towers were lying in rubble on the ground. The latest situation then from Whitehorse. Just to go over it once more, Scott Regier just reporting 2 aircraft on the ground, 1 cargo, 1 passenger jet. The passenger jet being treated as if it could be a hijacked aircraft, although that does not mean it was. It may simply have been one of the aircraft that has been diverted from American airspace into Canadian airspace to land at a Canadian airport. But the fact that 3 Canadian Forces fighter jets are circling the city of Whitehorse does take on a certain air of concern as to what may be happening there. However, we're on top of that situation. As soon as we know with any certainty what the situation is, we will let you know. Further confirmation now on the situation with U.S. President George Bush. He is at the Strategic Air Command base in Nebraska. He landed there about 35-40 minutes ago. We're told that he entered the bunker at the Strategic Air Command base in Nebraska at 6 minutes after 3, that's Eastern time, so a little less than half an hour ago. He's going to hold a national security meeting via teleconferencing. Vice President Cheney is, we're told, in a secure area of the White House. So things continue to unfold in that area. The President of the United States in a bunker in Omaha at the Strategic Air Command's Air Force Base in Offutt, I believe is the way it's pronounced, Nebraska. We're going to go down to Washington in a minute to check in with Henry Champ, who's been monitoring all this for us as well. Henry's just getting hooked up and see whether he can give us any more information on that front. Henry. Can't tell whether Henry is hooked up yet or not. He's not hooked up yet. Okay. All right, we'll go to Henry in a minute. Let's go to Edmonton, Alberta, where we'll check in on that situation. Ralph Klein making some statements today about his concern and perhaps the need on his part for the federal government to send in the army to take not control, but to help in terms of the safety of the oil fields in Alberta. Here's Ralph Klein. This was on tape from a little while ago.
Well, if we see the situation a year down the road as it is today, where there's a real threat of terrorism, or if we're in the midst of terrorism movements, then it's my personal thought, and I can't speak for the Prime Minister, it's my personal thought that it would be absolute folly to proceed with a summit of that magnitude.
But aren't there always risks of terrorism? How do you mean a heightened risk?
Well, there's without doubt, today, as we see the situation unfolding in the United States, I would venture a guess that the risk of terrorism is heightened because we saw how many planes today go down, you know, and deliberate attempts to cause devastation and destruction.
Brunswick. All right, Ralph Klein. His comments at a news conference a short time ago in Alberta, in Edmonton, in the Alberta capital, and his thoughts and concerns about next year's planned summit that is destined for Alberta, and his concerns that if things on this front don't improve over the next while, that there should be some thought given as to whether or not that summit should continue. So Ralph Klein in Alberta, and his concerns being expressed about what happened today. Well, we've heard from a couple of Canadian premiers today. One who is out of the country today and in New York City is the Premier of New Brunswick, Bernard Lord, who joins us now by telephone from New York. Premier Lord, where were you when all this happened this morning?
I was about 50 blocks away, so we were out of range of any immediate danger at that moment. I was in a business meeting when someone walked in and told us that two planes had crashed, and one each, into the World Trade Center. And immediately in the room, the thought was, well, this can't be a coincidence. And a few minutes later, someone from the consulate came in to inform me of what had taken place. And what took place after that, we went outside. We could clearly see the smoke over the city, and we saw thousands of people. We were in the midtown, so this northern of where the attack took place. We saw thousands of people walking from the southern part of the city and moving away as there was an exodus taking place. And it was done in an orderly, mostly calm fashion, but you could see in the faces of people the sorrow, the shock, and the devastation of what had taken place.
What is your plan now? I mean, obviously, for whatever reason you were in New York, that's long gone now.
Oh, yeah, that's gone now. All our meetings today were canceled, and it's really inconsequential compared to what took place here today. And we, obviously, our plane cannot fly. All planes are down. The tunnels and the bridges to get off the island are closed at the moment. So we're staying here until we can leave. But I'm not worried about that in the sense that our immediate safety is taken care of. And this compared, not the fact that we can't go home compared to what families and people are going through today is completely insignificant. And our thoughts and our prayers go to these families that have gone through, are going through hell at the moment. And I've been in contact with the Canadian consulate, and their main objective today is to identify where Canadians are, to see if any Canadians were victims, and to work and assist those who need help and inform the families. And I want to say, from what I've seen so far, the consulate here in New York is doing a very, very good job.
There's already a suggestion coming from a number of places that New York City, the United States for that matter, is going to need help in dealing with the aftermath of this, just simply from the medicinal sense of things, whether it's blood donations, whether it's emergency teams going in to help in New York in terms of the recovery and the rescue operations that are clearly going to be needed. What's your sense of that from being there on the scene?
Well, I think it's obvious that they will need help. And I think as Canadians and North Americans, we must do what we can to help our neighbors. This is what's happened today. Obviously, the immediate impact is here in New York and in Washington and Pennsylvania. But it will have an impact on the psyche of the American people, and also probably of the Canadian people, that there are certain things sometimes that we take for granted, such as our security. But today there was a clear attack on democracy and a clear attack that will change. The world we live in tonight is not the same as the world we lived in this morning. And I think we need to realize that, and all of us will have to cope with that and find ways to help the victims and to rebuild and ensure that we can continue to live in peace in this world and prosper.
I think everybody can understand what you're saying when you say the world we lived in when we woke up this morning is not the same as the one we're going to be living in when we fall asleep tonight. How is it, do you think, going to change our way of life?
Well, I think we will become more concerned as to some of the dangers that exist to the safety of our communities and our country, and the impacts of what that means to our daily lives, or things we take for granted. And I'm sure the people that jumped on those planes this morning never thought they would not see the end of the day. That's what took place, and it's tragic for those individuals. It's tragic for those families, and our work as people has to be to find ways to prevent that. And there's certain things we take for granted in life, and it's only when we face situations like this that we collectively realize maybe we're not doing enough to protect ourselves and to ensure the safety of our communities, our families, and our people. And I think what took place today will have an impact on the psyche of the American people, because they saw the symbol of the largest city in New York and the Pentagon, which is the symbol of the security of the nation, under attack and defenseless for a few hours.
Premier Lord, we know this has been an awfully difficult day for a lot of people, and you've been right there in the midst of it, and we do appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Well, you're welcome. Welcome.
Premier Bernard Lord, who was on a visit to New York today, on a business visit from New Brunswick, and was caught, obviously, in the middle of a horrific story. Fortunately, nowhere near the scene where the explosions took place, but still trying to recover from what he's witnessed today, and dealing with what is clearly going to be the aftermath for all of us. These pictures, what are we dealing with here? This is the Washington pictures where the Pentagon, these are from earlier today when the Pentagon was hit, and Henry Champ joins us now from Washington. And Henry, I know when we first talked about the situation outside the Pentagon, we were under the belief at that particular point that this was minor damage, a light aircraft. As it turns out, it's been much more horrific than that. What's the latest situation from the Pentagon area?
Well, the Pentagon, you're quite right. It is far more severe than what we had first been led to believe. Hospitals close by, the Pentagon report at least 40 people being treated as a result of this crash into the Pentagon. We have no indication of loss of life, although there is considerable, and it will be in the multiples of 20 because of the size of the plane, but we don't know specifically what that would be. It is enough to say that at that particular time, shortly after 9 o'clock, the Pentagon, being a place that starts early, would have been almost certainly fully staffed, and there would have been people in that region, and one presumes some casualties on the ground, hopefully not fatalities, but the severity and the impact of that plane makes that hard to believe. The incident at the State Department is somewhat less severe, and we don't have any reports from around Washington of any other problems. But what we do have is a city that is bedazzled, if you want, bemused, struck dumb, you might say. The downtown area is slowly becoming a ghost center. A lot of uncertainty as to what is to happen tomorrow. A lot of uncertainty about where command in this city is. We know that there is a relic of the Cold War, Peter, a bunker in West Virginia where it has always been understood the government under siege, should that ever happen, and you know, Peter and I don't think you and I ever believed that would happen, is available for the government. We know senior leaders have left the city under the care of the Secret Service. Whether they've gone there, whether they are somewhere else, we're not certain, but they're not in the city, and they are preparing for a teleconference with the president, who himself is in Nebraska at a base with total command capability and communications capability, and everybody in this city truly is waiting to see what is the next step.
Well, you're quite right. I don't think any of us ever contemplated having the images that we're witnessing, obviously, from our television screens, or the images that we're contemplating. The fact that the President of the United States is in a bunker in Omaha, whisked there as a result of these actions that took place in New York and Washington. His family, other members of the U.S. cabinet in secure location somewhere, perhaps, as you suggest, in that area in Virginia. There are a few people better connected in that city than you are, Henry. What's being said?
Well, I think one of the things that's really unfortunate in all of this, and even as I talk to you about it, I feel we're perhaps a step ahead of the game, but nonetheless, there is a concern among a lot of people that I deal with every day in government and within the media, wondering about the actions of the president. There's no question he'd be under the care and the advice of the Secret Service, but there is a feeling that somehow this isn't presidential to be in Nebraska when the nation is clearly in a considerable position of uncertainty and concern. And I've heard no few people talk about the fact, why isn't he here? Why is he not taken to the air more often? Why has there not been more explanation of what's gone on? Again, I don't know what advice he's getting, and none of us know the actual extent of severity or threat there is to the United States. But these are defining moments for leaders, and there is that whispering campaign, if you want, that has begun about the leadership that's being displayed by the president.
Obviously, decisions are taken at a very high level, including the president himself, about where he should be going on days like this. Obviously, they know or suspect things that we don't know, or perhaps have even suspected on a day like this, and so that's all enters the decision-making process. But nevertheless, as you say, these are defining moments. You know, when you and I were a lot younger, when Jack Kennedy was faced with the Cuban Missile Crisis, there had been discussions about moving the administration and the core of the government outside of Washington for those days. He said no to that. When President Reagan was shot, there was a consideration given, at least on the part of some, that they may have to move outside of the White House. They chose not to. Today, the very fact that he's gone hopscotch from Florida to Louisiana to Omaha, it's probably going to be some time before we know what led to that decision-making process. But as you say, a defining moment.
Exactly, and if you remember, and I'm sure you do, because certainly I do, the refusal of Prime Minister Trudeau to leave the viewing stand in Quebec when it was under a rock attack was the kind of thing, no matter how people felt about the Prime Minister, whether they were on his side or not politically or spiritually, nonetheless he gained a lot of admiration for his decision on that particular day. As I say, at the same time you're saying this, you have to be aware of the fact that the Navy, the U.S. Navy, has moved good portions of its fleet out into the Atlantic from its Virginia ports to protect Washington and New York. That seems extreme as I sit here only a couple of blocks away from the White House, and to any of many thousands of others who are continuing their job in Washington. To take that kind of decision makes you wonder if there are things going on that we don't know anything about, and just exactly what the threat is that the United States is being faced. But all the more reason, I would think, that the President or others would be speaking more directly to the public. I've been watching television, as you have, coming from the United States, and that bank of monitors you have, Henry, and you see a lot of leaders from other places.
Got to stop you. We're going to go switch right away to, we believe, well, here's a White House Speaker. Karen Hughes is speaking on behalf of George Bush. Let's listen in.
While some federal buildings have been evacuated for security reasons and to protect our workers, your federal government continues to function effectively. We have a federal emergency response plan, and at President Bush's direction, we are implementing it. We began to implement it immediately after the first attack in New York this morning. We contacted American forces and embassies throughout the world and placed them on high alert. The United States Secret Service immediately secured the President, the Vice President, and the Speaker of the House, and they are all safe. They have also secured members of the National Security Team, the President's cabinet, and senior staff. As you know, President Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, when the first attack occurred this morning. Air Force One has now landed at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, and the President is in a secure location. He is in continuous communication with the Vice President and key members of his cabinet and national security team. Vice President Cheney and our National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice, are in a secure facility at the White House. I have just come from there. The Secretary of Transportation and other members of our White House senior staff are gathered at a command center there, and we are coordinating with other branches of our federal government. The Secretary of Defense remains at the Pentagon, and the Secretary of State is en route back to Washington from his trip to South America. President Bush is conducting a meeting of the National Security Council as we speak. They are meeting President Bush from his location and other members from different locations in Washington and other locations. As many of you have been reporting, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all airports closed, and all planes which were in the air were directed to land at the nearest airport. International flights were diverted to alternate locations outside of the United States. Transportation Secretary Mineta has directed the Federal Aviation Administration to suspend operations until at least noon tomorrow. So no airline flights will operate until at least then and until the FAA announces that operations will be resumed. Secretary Mineta has also issued orders controlling the movement of all vessels in United States navigable waters. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has activated 8 urban search and rescue task forces in New York, and 4 of these highly trained teams are at work here in Washington at the Pentagon. Every federal agency has implemented continuity of operations plans to make sure the government continues to function effectively. While the markets closed today because of the situation in Manhattan, the United States financial system has continued to operate. Banks have been open all day. The Federal Reserve has operated regularly and continuously. The Department of Health and Human Services has mobilized medical personnel and supplies to provide help to local authorities who are working so diligently to respond and try to help the victims of these terrible attacks. President Bush has committed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to identify and bring to swift justice those responsible for these despicable attacks. The Department of Justice is setting up a hotline for families who fear that their relatives may have been victims of one of these attacks, and we will be announcing that telephone number shortly. Our fellow citizens and our freedom came under attack today, and no one should doubt America's resolve. President Bush and all our country's leaders thank the many Americans who are helping with rescue and relief efforts. We ask our fellow Americans for your prayers for the victims, for their families, for the rescue workers, and for our country. Thank you all very much, and we will continue to update you as information is available and confirmed.
Karen, how long will the President stay in Nebraska?
Return to the White House.
Will he go back to Washington, Karen? Will he address the nation?
Questions being shouted to Karen Hughes, the senior policy advisor to U.S. President George W. Bush. She is in Washington. The president is in a bunker in Omaha right now. Karen Hughes saying that the president is conducting a National Security Council meeting right now by teleconferencing. A number of U.S. cabinet ministers in undisclosed locations, some actually still in their office, including the head of the Pentagon. The defense secretary is at the Pentagon, which was under attack this morning and is still dealing with the after effect of that. The U.S. vice president is at a secure location at the White House, according to Karen Hughes. Obviously, the discussions that are taking place now are on what to do next, how best to deal with the situation as it is, and how to confirm that everything is safe once again. But in the time being, all air traffic over the United States will be not operating before at the earliest noon tomorrow. That's a live shot from New York, where the smoke continues to billow into the sky over the scene where used to stand the enormous twin towers of the World Trade Center. Okay, final update on the Whitehorse situation, and it is good news. As we discussed earlier, there was no confirmation that there had been a hijacking. In fact, there had not. Let's go to pictures from the scene in Whitehorse. There had been, this is one of the Canadian Forces CF-18 fighters that was circling the Whitehorse airport and had just escorted 2 aircraft into the Whitehorse area. They'd both been diverted from flights heading towards Alaska. One here was a Korean cargo jet. The other was a Korean jumbo jet. We are told that much of the concern over whether or not there had been a hijacking was based on the fact that the Korean airliner, I believe it's this one, the 747, had declared an emergency coming into land, but that emergency had to do with concern over fuel and whether or not it had enough fuel to reach Whitehorse. In fact, all is safe and on the ground. The aircraft were not allowed to land in the U.S. Airspace in Alaska because of the ban on aircraft coming in. So as it turns out, those 2 Korean airliners in Whitehorse really are no different, including the 747 here, no different than the various aircraft that are now on tarmacs across this country from Vancouver to St. John's, having to be landed in Canada because they could not go on to the U.S. So this was the aircraft that there had been concern about in Whitehorse. Some concerns and some suggestions that it might have been a hijack threat. In fact, it wasn't. It was just running low on fuel. So a good ending to the story out of Whitehorse. Now, let's update the situation at the Halifax airport, where there have been dozens of aircraft on the tarmac at various points of the day. Paul Withers is standing by there. Paul, what's the latest from Halifax?
Peter, you know, here in Halifax, we have an indication of what's happening at airports all across the country. Here in Halifax right now, there are 44 jets that were destined for the U.S., essentially parked on the runways of an idle airport. The RCMP are doing security sweeps on each plane, and we were just briefed by airport officials here in Halifax who told us that it's going to take the Mounties an hour and a half to sweep each plane. Now, there are thousands of people literally stranded on planes at the Halifax International Airport. Some of them are looking to be stranded on those planes until tomorrow, perhaps even as late as the day after. That's an indication of just how inconvenient this situation is and the ripple effect of those devastating tragedies, as we know, in New York and in Washington. Here, there were no incidents. The number of planes that landed in a very short space of time were much greater than normal in Halifax, obviously, but there were no problems reported with pilots landing at an unfamiliar airport, no problems reported with gasoline, for example, no medical emergencies reported here. So far, however, the only passengers from Europe who have landed in Halifax, who have actually left the building, as it were people who were on a regularly scheduled Canada 3000 flight from London to Halifax to Toronto. The people who were destined for Toronto were all taken off the plane. Many have been on the airport for an hour or so, had no idea what had happened, and we were talking to them, explaining what had happened. It was almost impossible to explain it, and their reactions were just absolute disbelief, as you would expect. Those people have been sent to a Halifax suburb for the evening, an ice hockey rink, where they'll be staying. The thousands of others that, as the Mounties gradually process them, will be sent to other sports stadiums in the Halifax area. To recap, 44 planes on the ground. The city of Halifax, or the Halifax airport, is open to take more. There are no planes within 100 miles, we're told, of Halifax airport, so there may not be any more flights here. Though the big news here is just how long these passengers are going to be stranded on these planes. Many will be here for hours and hours and hours. The airport is sending them food and water, and power is being hooked up to those airplanes that need it to run the air conditioners. But so far, the Mounties have taken off just 3 planes. Passengers from 3 planes, they remain in the Halifax building. waiting for buses to take them elsewhere. But again, a lot of people, thousands, are going to be stranded here in Halifax, probably the same situation across the country. Back to you, Peter.
All right, Paul, thanks very much, and thank you for that report. Obviously, all of us who travel by air know what it's like to be delayed in different cities, and especially when it's a delay, meaning sitting on an aircraft on a tarmac, and how difficult and tense that can be at times. However, I think when this situation is fully explained and passengers on these various aircraft in different parts of this country sitting on tarmacs understand the scope of what's happened today, the fact that they're sitting on a plane on a tarmac in Halifax or Vancouver or Calgary or wherever, they will feel pretty good about the safety of that. Now, the latest situation from the United States, as the President of the United States convening an emergency conference of his national security advisors over the situation that has unfolded throughout the day.